Our days on life are uncertain. Life can suddenly take a turn for the worse. It could be a financial disaster, maybe a health crisis, a broken relationship, a sudden death of a loved one, or 100 other things. It just knocks us down and leaves us stunned. And the book of Ruth starts out like that, with just one crisis after another. But the book of Ruth is not just about a story about disaster, but as we see the story unfold, we see a story of friendship and love and loyalty, hope and redemption. And the story symbolically tells a greater story of God's redemption and his faithfulness to his people. So, it starts out very badly, like we're going to see. But hope is around the corner. Ruth 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So let's take a look at the book of Ruth. In a nutshell, the book is about a Hebrew family that faces a drought and moves from the hometown of Bethlehem to Moab in search of more favorable farming conditions. However, things don't go well for them there either. So it all happens in a town called Bethlehem. The town's located 5 miles south of Jerusalem, and it's a mountainous area with an elevation of 2,453 feet, about 100 feet higher than Jerusalem. So up there in the mountains, the people of Bethlehem, they had quite a view. Looking eastward, they would see the breathtaking drop of the wavy hills of the wilderness. Even further down the valley would be the Dead Sea, 1,407 feet below sea level. So from Bethlehem to the Dead Sea, there'd be this drop in elevation of 3,860 feet in a distance of only 15 miles. On the other side of the Dead Sea, the gray-purple hills of Moab rose dramatically in the distance. The name Bethlehem means house of bread. And Bethlehem got its name because of the agriculture surrounding the town. So farmers grew barley and wheat, 2 grains that grew very well in the soil and climate in this area. Bethlehem has a Mediterranean climate with hot and dry summers and mild, wetter winters. Bethlehem receives an average of 28 inches of rainfall each year, mostly between the months of November and January. And in contrast, the Dead Sea, just 15 miles away, receives only 2 inches of annual rainfall. So, in good times, crops are plentiful for the Bethlehem farmers and life is good. But Bethlehem is also situated in a place that leaves it open to the possibility of blistering heat and famine. So next, when did all these events in the book of Ruth occur? What all happened during the period of the Judges. The time of Judges was a dark period in Israel's history. It's described in the Bible as a time when Israel had no king and everyone did just as they saw fit. And that phrase, everyone did as they saw fit, that seems like it was written about America today, doesn't it? We live in a day of relative truth and personal freedom where everyone wants to declare what's true for them and be able to choose just how to live based on personal preference. Israel's social and spiritual life just was a mess. And so during this period of the Judges, Israel repeats a cycle of disobedience and repentance, God's intervention, then gratitude, then back to disobedience again. There are a few main characters to keep in mind in the book of Ruth. First, there's Elimelech. And Elimelech is the father of the family in the story. The name Elimelech means, my God is king. That was his name, my God is king. So imagine if you called Elimelech on the phone. In their language, you wouldn't say, "May I speak with Elimelech, please?" You'd say, "May I speak with God is King, please?" That's quite a name to live up to. And the interesting thing is, people in that time and culture, they tended to name their children much like we name our pets today. When we name kids in America, the goal these days seems to be originality. We make up names because they sound good. And so we get names like Ayana, Chantel, Camden, or Dawson. And even simple names like Addison can be spelled at least a dozen different ways because parents like these unique spellings. They want to be different. But in Bible times, names reflected a person's character. The first dog that Judy and I owned was a mixed breed that had tons of energy and spark. And so we named him Sparky. It just fit him. In this picture, he's just gotten into Judy's knitting. He seemed to always be getting into something. So Sparky was his name because of his energy and his enthusiasm, even though sometimes it was misplaced. And just as Sparky's name fit his personality, names in the ancient Hebrew culture also had a meaning. They weren't just 2 or 3 meaningless syllables strung together. Well, next we meet Naomi. And Naomi's name meant pleasant. That's a very optimistic name, isn't it? I once knew a girl named Happy, and she really did seem happy most of the time. She had a wonderful smile and a very positive outlook on life. And that's how I imagine Naomi. She saw the brighter side of life. When things went wrong, Naomi was the one we could always count on to see the silver lining. People could always count on Naomi to be upbeat and encouraging. Well, next comes Mahlon. And Mahlon was a son of Elimelech and Naomi. His name meant sickly. Sickly. Obviously, he didn't look very healthy when born. Maybe his parents wondered if he would even survive, so they named him Sickly. Certainly wasn't the picture of health. He must have caught every bug that went around. I imagine Mahlon with a perpetual cold or worse. Well, Mahlon became Ruth's husband in the story. And then next, there's Kilian. And Kilian is Elimelech and Naomi's other son, and his name meant weakling. So imagine this. We have 2 brothers, Sickly and Weakling. And these weren't nicknames given to them by the neighborhood kids. These weren't names that other kids used to mock them. These were the actual names given to them by their parents. These were birth certificate names. Next, we have Orpah. And Orpah is a woman from Moab. And Orpah means deer or fawn. So she was probably the athletic type. Orpah became the wife of Kilian. It's hard to imagine why Orpah, the athletic type, married Weakling, but she did. Now, there's an interesting side note. I once heard Oprah Winfrey say that her mother named her after Orpah in the Bible, but she misspelled the name. So she should have been Orpah Winfrey, but ended up being Oprah Winfrey. Well, finally comes the main character in the book, Ruth. The name Ruth carries various meanings, such as beauty, personality, and friendship. And Ruth lived up to all of these. She was a beautiful person, both inside and out. And I imagined her beauty in the way that she carried herself, the way she related with others, both done with utmost grace. And she proved to be a friend, demonstrating loyalty even in the most difficult circumstances. Now, the marriage of the Hebrew boys, Mahlon and Kilian, to the Moabite girls, Orpah and Ruth, is worth thinking about. Deuteronomy 7:3, it forbids the Israelites from intermarrying with the people of Canaan, the land they were possessing. And the reason is given in verse 4. They will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods. But Moab is not part of Canaan. So a marriage of the Hebrews to the Moabites was not specifically forbidden. However, we do see from Solomon's experience later on that intermarriage was not the best idea. Just as Deuteronomy 7:4 warned about intermarriage with the Canaanites, the same was true of other nations. Intermarriage brought with it a temptation to serve the gods of one's foreign wife. And probably Most Orthodox Israelites would have thought that marrying Moabite women was not the wisest thing to do, and some eyebrows would be raised when they heard that Mahlon and Chilion had married these foreign wives. The reality is that when Ruth married Mahlon, Ruth was a foreigner. She didn't worship the God of the Israelites, and that could have been potential for trouble down the road. So what's going on in this book of Ruth? Well, remember, the name Bethlehem means the house of bread or the house of food. And this house of food is running out of food. Bethlehem is situated on the edge with the desert on one side and the Fertile Crescent on the other. So in good times, farmers would grow a lot of crops. But a change in the weather patterns could leave Bethlehem in famine. And that's where we find Elimelech and his family, facing a famine. 3 or 4 consecutive years of inadequate rainfall would just be disastrous for Bethlehem farmers who totally depended upon the rainfall for their crops. And there were no irrigation options. When I taught 4th grade, one of the subjects I taught was California history. We learned about the making of the California Aqueduct, that massive water pipeline that stretches from Northern California to Southern California. It was built because Southern California is largely a desert. If we had to rely on just rainfall, we'd be sunk. Well, in ancient Bethlehem, there were no pipelines, no sprinklers, no drip irrigation systems. It was just rain. Some years that was very good, and other years it was very bad. Of course, the famine could have been caused by Israel's perpetual cycle of disobedience against God that we talked about earlier. Although the Bible doesn't specifically say that that's the case, it certainly is possible that God sent the famine to punish his people for their sinful ways. So there was a famine in the land, and Elimelech faced 3 choices. First, he and his family could starve. Not a very good option, is it? Second, he could change his occupation. That seems like a good idea, but isn't really very realistic since there really weren't many options in this area other than farming. And his third option would be to move. And that's what he chose to do. Now, he hoped it would be a temporary move and would take him to a place where there would be no drought and farming was better. So Elimelech chose to go to Moab. He could see its purple mountains in the distance from Bethlehem. And it made sense to go there since its hills were higher than Bethlehem and so it had the potential for more rain. Of course, moving to Moab meant that Elimelech was moving into enemy territory. The Moabites were descendants of Lot from his incestuous union with his firstborn daughter, so they didn't have a positive beginning. And Moab hadn't been friendly with the Israelites. It was the Moabites who forbade Israel to travel through their country on the way to the Promised Land. In the days of the judges, Eglon, the king of Moab, invaded Israelite lands as far as Jericho and oppressed Israel for 18 years. So they weren't really on friendly terms. But that's where Elimelech moved his family, to Moab. But things didn't go as planned. In Moab, Elimelech died. It's somewhat ironic that he went to Moab to escape death, but ended up dying in Moab. Of course, his death was a setback for Naomi. In that place and time, women were valued only by their connection to a man. Unmarried women derived their value from their fathers, and married women from their husbands. And the security of women depended on the husband's ability to provide for them. So when a married woman lost a husband, as Naomi did, her value declined steeply, and her safety and security depended then on her sons. But then tragedy struck again. Not only did Naomi's husband die, but then her sons died too. And at this point, Naomi was destitute. She was on a social level below even servants. And to make matters worse, she was a foreigner in Moab, the lowest of the low. So everything was taken from Naomi. It reminds us somewhat of the story of Job, when everything was taken from him. But in one way, Naomi had it even worse than Job, because she was a woman. She had no one to turn to for help. So that's the opening scene in the book of Ruth. And it looks pretty bleak, doesn't it? With famines and death. But the thing to keep in mind is that the story is just beginning and hope is not lost. And that's a good reminder for us today. When we're faced with struggles and challenges, heartache and heartbreak, we need to remember that our faith is not based on our circumstances. Our faith is based on our eternal God. And in His time, we will see His grace and faithfulness shine through.